For centuries, people have bemoaned the breakdown of the family. They've pointed to rising divorce rates, out-of-wedlock childbearing, and women working outside the home as signs of a crisis in family values. This crisis purportedly explains a whole host of social problems, everything from juvenile delinquency to drug addiction. Yet when we take the longer view of history, we see that the family has always changed in step with larger social forces, whether those forces be a Great Recession or a major world war. Now, this isn't to say that the American family hasn't changed rapidly and dramatically over the past 50 years. It has. It's just to say that the American family has always been changing, and American society has always been anxious about these changes. In this lecture, I want to review family life throughout U.S. history with a focus on the changing family today. When people think of the traditional family, they typically conjure up images from the 1950s. The Leave It to Beaver family with a breadwinner husband, a stay-at-home mom, and 2.5 biological children. Any departure from this traditional family is considered abnormal. Heiner argues that the breadwinner homemaker family isn't actually all that traditional or normal. In fact, according to Heiner, this family form was, quote, most unusual and historically almost freakish. Beginning in 1900, birth rates began to fall, divorce rates began to rise, and people began to marry at later ages. But in the years following World War II, there was a temporary reversal of these trends. Men and women began to marry at younger ages. They began to have an increasing number of children, producing what we call the baby boomer generation. Women, whose labor force participation had been creeping upward since 1900, were expected to find fulfillment in the home. Thus, the 1950s family was historically unique. It represented a reversal of trends that had been occurring since 1900. Both Heiner and Stephanie Coontz argue that the 1950s family was made possible only by enormous government intervention. That is, the so-called golden age of the family was supported by government funds that allowed returning World War II veterans to attend college, buy homes, and obtain jobs. And these funds allowed men to marry at younger ages, have many children, and support a family on their income alone. In addition, the so-called golden age of the family was not so golden. Women who were encouraged to find fulfillment in marriage and childbearing were subjected to unprecedented levels of depression and anxiety, which helps explain the high rates of alcoholism and psychiatric treatment at this time. In fact, a whole new syndrome called housewife's blight was identified and treated with a litany of anti-anxiety drugs. A third problem with the breadwinner homemaker model of the 1950s was that it was unaffordable to most poor families, since poor men couldn't afford to support a family on their income alone. So in addition to being a rather unusual household structure, the Leave It to Beaver family was unattainable to many. Finally, as Stephanie Coontz points out, there were many problems with the traditional family that were simply swept under the rug. For example, there were very high rates of teen pregnancy, but pregnant teens were forced to leave town in the middle of the night, such that the problem went unrecognized. Child abuse was also rampant, but it was considered a private family matter. Finally, spousal rape and spousal abuse were tolerated and ignored as a critical social problem. It is true that we're in the midst of a period of very rapid social change, in which family life is changing dramatically. Today, 2/3 of all married women work outside the home, compared to just 16% in 1950. Half of all marriages end in divorce, which is 3 times the rate that it was in 1950. Finally, only 25% of all households today are made up of married couples with children. The decline of the married couple household explains in part our growing obsession with marriage. The government's promotion of marriage, the public debate over same-sex marriage, and the fear among many that they'll never find someone to marry. But the fact is that family life wasn't always so romantic, and our present isn't all that bad. We need to put the American family in historical perspective. As Stephanie Coontz points out, at the turn of the 20th century, child labor was rampant, with thousands of children working full-time, often 6 days a week, in mines, mills, and sweatshops. As well, women couldn't vote, and there were few opportunities for them in the labor market, such that many poor women had little choice but to turn to prostitution. Finally, infant mortality and child abuse were rampant, with very high rates of both. Compare these problems to family life today, in which child abuse is taken quite seriously, fathers are incredibly involved in the day-to-day lives of their children, and infant and child mortality are at historic lows. Even divorce, however painful an experience it may be, reflects expanded opportunities for women to leave abusive relationships and for men and women to leave unhappy marriages. We certainly have problems in the family today, but we also have more choices than ever and a safer family environment than at any point in history. In the end, there has been as much improvement in American family life as there has been crisis. Indeed, we could say that family relations have never been stronger. People are going to unprecedented lengths to find life partners, to strengthen their marriages, and to be good parents. What we seem to be confronting now is a crisis in the institution of the family rather than a crisis in family values. And by this I mean that Americans remain incredibly committed to starting and nurturing families. But family life remains stubbornly structured around the now outdated model of a stay-at-home woman and breadwinner man. As Stephanie Coontz argues, the biggest problem facing families as this century draws to a close is not that our families have changed too much, but that our institutions have changed too little. American work policies are 50 years out of date, designed for a time when moms weren't in the workforce and most dads didn't understand the joys of being involved in childcare. Thus, our topic for next week is how the institutions of work and family life have failed to keep up with the changing relationships and structures of the family. Until then, have a good week.